Welcome to this Oxford Civic Society talk. My name is Ian Green and I'm the Oxford Civic Society chairman. The title for our talk tonight is Liveable Streets, Bringing Them to Oxford. In the continuing struggle against COVID-19, social and physical distancing measures have reduced public transport capacity to about 1/3 of pre-pandemic capacity in the city. Figures from Phil Southall of the Oxford Bus Company. They're running 95% of their services, but at 35% or so of occupancy. This means that whilst a large proportion of the population can continue to work remotely, those who cannot rely on private transport to keep the country and economy moving. Low traffic neighbourhoods is a flagship transport scheme currently being funded by central government nationally, with the intention of eliminating gridlock and pollution spike. It is not without opponents. Concerns have been raised that measures used in low traffic neighbourhoods, which are designed to relieve pressure on the transport system, are actually causing gridlock through poor design and implementation. Our speaker this evening is extremely well qualified to explain the benefits of low traffic neighbourhoods and how to ensure that the benefits to neighbourhoods do not lead to problems elsewhere. Professionally, Dr. Scott Urban is college lecturer in economics for visiting students at Hertford College in Oxford University. He's also a senior advisor for international finance for Oxford Analytica, director of Oxford FX Limited and a partner of Oxford InnoSpace. On a voluntary basis, Scott is very active. He's treasurer of People, Place and Participation Limited, which is better known as Flows, the place in the park. And he's also director of Oxfordshire Liveable Streets. Flows is a community-owned and run hub for people to meet, work, play, create, learn, eat and connect. Opened since September 2018, Flows is working to connect people of all ages in the Florence Park and Cowley and provide a space where people can relax and meet each other in the heart of a beautiful park. Oxfordshire Liveable Streets, and this is where Scott's credentials for this evening's talk come in. Oxford Liveable Streets is an advocacy organisation committed to improving the lives of Oxfordshire residents through innovations in neighbourhood design, street and highway layout, and transport infrastructure. It advocates the prioritisation of active travel, such as walking and cycling, and the replacement of the current model under which private motor vehicles dominate our streets and neighbourhoods. Learning from development in the Netherlands in the 1970s and changes being made currently elsewhere in the UK, Oxfordshire Liveable Streets hopes that its efforts will benefit everyone in Oxfordshire. Giving more space to people instead of cars will generate more connectivity, more community, and more livability. I should add that Scott's additional qualification is that he's been a resident of East Oxford since 2001. He, his wife, and 2 young children live in East Oxford. Wearing his Oxfordshire Liveable Streets hat, and in 40 to 45 minutes, Scott will explain low traffic neighbourhoods with successful examples from elsewhere. He'll go on to discuss how they're being implemented here in Oxford, and we'll then have 15 to 20 minutes for questions and answers. Please use the icon on your screen to register the fact, I think it's a wave, a hand wave, to register the fact that you'd like to speak. And after the presentation, Ian Salisbury who will moderate the questions, and he will call on you to give your question in person on screen. Now, if you would like to click on the speaker view, I'll hand over to Scott and to start the presentation. Thank you very much, Scott.
Thanks a lot, Ian. I will share screen now.
Yep.
How's that looking? Whoop, not too good.
Good.
Yeah, oh, good. Fantastic. Okay, so yeah, good evening, and thanks so much for having me here. What a huge honor this is. So this is about low traffic neighborhoods or livable streets and bringing them to Oxford. Again, I think, Ian, you've run through basically who I am and what I do, so I'm going to skip this slide. Tonight's talk, just to give you a bit of an overview, we'll just do some of the basics, and then there's actually quite a bit to talk about in this topic. So it's kind of hard to choose what to cover and what not, but here's what we will do. Some very basic things about what the heck is a low traffic neighborhood, and so what? Like why is this such a talked about issue right now? Why would we want such a thing? So a little bit about that. And then let's talk about the UK-wide context, because this is a topic that really is on the radar now in a way that it just wasn't even a year ago. I mean, it was there, but not nearly to the extent that you see it now. So we'll talk about what's happening in the whole nation. And then we'll focus a bit on Oxford, and we'll talk about the policy context for Oxford and also the kind of outlook, such that anyone knows. And then the final bit is about consultation, and yeah. So this is, as Ian Green just mentioned, it can be a very heated issue. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then hopefully there'll be some time for some questions afterwards. So on we go. What is a low traffic neighborhood? So an LTN, probably the very easiest way to describe it, is about a half square kilometer up to 2 square kilometers area that you design out any shortcutting by traffic. So everything is reachable by car, just like it is now. No one's home is denied vehicular access. Everything's reachable. It's just that you prevent anyone from being able to short circuit or shortcut through that residential area. So we've got a little video here I'd like to show you. This is by Andy Coram, one of our members, OLS members. And I just think it says more than I can probably do. So let's just watch that quickly. Okay, so a low traffic neighborhood, it's, I think we're all familiar with some of the concepts that have been used over time to reduce traffic, the presence of traffic, or at least the speed of traffic in our residential areas. You're looking at a couple of them here, be it a speed hump or a so-called pinch point or some chicanes. We've been working on ways, we as a country have been working on ways for decades to try to tame the influence of the motor vehicle in our residential area. And the truth is, we've been doing this for a long time. So a low traffic neighborhood might well have some of these features, but what makes it distinctive is it goes beyond these features by actually doing something a little bit more dramatic, which is introducing this concept of a modal filter. And that's, you're looking at one here. Now this is Waltham Forest in London. And you can see that right there is a modal filter. What it is cars can't drive through those wooden pylons you see behind that group of people, but bikes obviously can, buggies, etc. And in the bargain, you also get yourself a little piazza in this case. And I've been to this location several times. I've seen people describe it locally as their piazza, actually, whether it be on a bake sale or just hanging out. So it's pretty neat. So that's a filter. And by the way, that's what that location looked like before this intervention, before the low traffic neighborhood. But filters don't have to be as fancy as that. Here we are back in Oxford. You're looking at East Oxford. These are some modal filters in East Oxford, and of course on East Avenue in East Oxford. And the folks who live on East Avenue are very grateful for these. And actually, interestingly, these are a remnant from a 1985 scheme in Oxford City, which did a massive amount of traffic filtering between the Plain and Holloway. But some of that remains, and this is evidence of that scheme, and this is one of the filters that remains. So another thing that you would find in a low traffic neighborhood are various inducements to cycling, right? To help enable people who want to cycle to do everything they can to try and enable that. So one is, of course, the filters themselves, because when you take the through traffic out, you go from maybe 4,000 vehicle movements a day to 200 or something. It makes a complete difference to the local environment, to the impression that cars make. But another thing you can do, as they've done in Waltham Forest and now in Hackney and many places in London, are lay on these so-called cycle hangers. And you're looking at one here, and that's the great Paul Gasson from Waltham Forest giving a tour there. And the cycle hanger can accommodate 6 cycles and secure lockable storage on street. So, and we have the same problem in Oxford as you find in Waltham Forest, where it's difficult to store your bikes inside. We have lots of HMO residency in Oxford, so something like this be very welcome for in many neighborhoods where it's very difficult to deal with bikes. So you want to, this is a way, an LTN is a way for the local authority to actually provide, to be foot forward here and provide for cycling, and really saying this is something we want to encourage. And this is 6 cycles and at the cost of 1 space for a vehicle. And it should be stated that these things have massive waiting lists in Waltham Forest. They have, I think, 400 or so cycle hangers, and they have a waiting list in the thousands. So it's extremely popular. Another thing about an LTN is, you know, ideally there would be some placemaking. And here's just what that particular junction looks like before the LTN. And the engineers took a look at that, and the residents, and said, well, you know, if we are reducing vehicular movement so much, why do we need all that tarmac? So this is one of the interventions you can have, is some placemaking in place of this huge sea of tarmac. Now, of course, that's not always going to be possible because that's dependent upon financing. But again, this is sort of best case. Best examples are from Waltham Forest in London. So, like I said, so what? Why do we want these? You know, I've sort of mentioned that the impression that cars make on our environment, but really, what is the motivation here? What do we have to gain from low traffic neighborhoods? And really, it's reclaiming our local areas so that we free people up to do things other than use the car. And it's not to say you can't use a car, but it is the case that we have too many children going to school by car, being driven to car because maybe their parents don't feel safe with the kid using active travel. We have people doing short journeys by car because it's convenient, and I understand this totally. I mean, it's just natural to do the most convenient thing. And so the LTNs are a little bit about saying, well, make those short journeys more convenient and more attractive by active means. And so what we find is that when you implement an LTN, you get an overall reduction in the car journeys. And also, you know, this is really important because nationally we know that, you know, around 35% of journeys of less than 2 miles are undertaken by car. So that's really what we're talking about here, is trying to redress that balance a little bit. And I just wanted to show you this example of someone very recently, I don't know, yeah, the dates, this is September 5th tweet. And this person's saying, you know, I was sitting around saying, oh, I fancy going to Marks and Spencer. Let me just hop in the car, as you do. I totally get that. And then she realized, oh, it's going to be a little bit of a nuisance because I'm going to have to drive an extra 200 meters or half a kilometer. I have no idea. And she said, you know, it'd be a lot easier just to jump on my bike. And she realized this is what's happening, right? This is this behavioral change that's being induced by the low traffic neighborhood. And by the way, if you go visit somewhere like Waltham Forest, where these things have been bedded in for quite a number of years now, you will, and you ask people around, you know, you'll hear a variety of opinions, no question about that. But I know in my own experience, I remember, you know, meeting people who've said, oh yeah, initially, like my husband hated it because he had to drive, made his drive to work horrible. And then suddenly he decided, oh, I'd be better off just walking. And he did, and he lost weight in the process. And it was a great outcome. So this is something about, we have to take this head on with a low traffic neighborhood. It is about prioritizing active travel. It's not saying you can't use the car, but it's just making active travel the priority journey, means of journey. Another thing that low traffic neighborhoods do, this is not something I see as much sort of on Twitter or in the discussions, but I wanted to highlight it, which is about the social fabric of our neighborhoods. Donald Appleyard back in the 60s, this is a UK academic who relocated to the US, but he recognized through his own studies that actually vehicular movements in neighborhoods really sever people on they sever the neighborhoods, and then people on different sides of the street don't know each other as well. And you can see this in this table in the bottom right. You can see the SF of San Francisco, and he just looked at light, medium, and heavily trafficked streets. So traffic volume of 2,000 cars per day, or 8,000 or 16,000 in the case of San Francisco. And he just counted up the average number of friendships on the street. And, they fall from 3 in a lightly trafficked road all the way down to 0.9 in the heavily trafficked street. And there's a student in Bristol repeated this study in Bristol and found very much the same to be the case in the area that he was examining. So I think another thing that we shouldn't overlook about low traffic neighborhoods is that it's bringing neighborhoods back together. People talk about these filters being a kind of severance, but actually it's just the opposite. That's why in Oxfordshire Liveable streets we call the filters connectors, because actually it's the presence of excess vehicular movements that is the severance. Also important to say that a reason that we want low traffic neighborhoods is for economic revitalization. So for our high streets, not every neighborhood has a high street, but it is the case that in Oxford, many neighborhoods which could be treated by low traffic neighborhoods do have high streets. And I'm thinking here of somewhere like Jericho, which has Walton Street, or the St. Mary's ward, that area of East Oxford, which has the Magdalen Road as a sort of high street there. And of course, you go from a scene like this, which is a traffic clogged street. Now you're looking at Orford Road here in Waltham Forest, to a scene like this, which is a pedestrianization of that high street. So this can be an element of a low traffic neighborhood scheme. And I would just urge people to go for it. There's a lot of sometimes difficulty really embracing that full-throated approach to livability, but actually this is what brings vitality to the high street. These cars are not what brings vitality to the high street. It's this. So that's another thing to mention about livable neighborhoods. They can include these kind of elements of in the high street if they do encompass a high street. Okay, so where does this come from, the LTNs? How long have these been around? And I think the best way I would answer this question is this graph right here. This is where LTNs come from. And what I mean by this graph is that it may be the case that 30, 40 years ago, people, coming of age, young children, 30, 40 years ago, frankly didn't need a low traffic neighborhood. They could travel to school by bike or walking, and their parents likewise, perhaps to their workplace, it depends, or by public transportation, but certainly walking to get to the bus stop, etc. They had little need of a low traffic neighborhood because the vehicular movements were so much smaller than they are today. So this is my answer about where's LTN come from. This is it. You're looking at it right here. And you can see that I mentioned this slide earlier. I showed you the slide earlier. The country up and down the UK is full of these kinds of infrastructure interventions in neighborhood areas designed to try and deal with this excess vehicular movements and speeding and to calm it down. These are all called traffic calming measures, and they do have a place, but they have not proved sufficient to deal with the problem. So on the right-hand side here, you're looking at Reimers Lane in East Oxford. A friend of mine's counted the number of pinch points between, along this Reimers Lane and Cricket Road, and there's 11. And it's actually makes it very difficult to cycle because you have to kind of squeeze through any car that goes through there is going to squeeze you up against the pinch point, et cetera, et cetera. But it's, these are sort of evidence that, this problem has been around. It hasn't been for lack of trying that hasn't gone away. It's just that we need something more fundamental. And of course, this is something that has occurred to places in London, and what I mean particularly is the borough of Waltham Forest, where in 2015, 2014, they really began implementing this approach, the low traffic neighborhood approach, as part of a package of measures, but this is certainly one of the key elements of their measures in Waltham Forest. And so when we think about where do low traffic neighbors come from, in a proximate sense, and I mean that proximate without the A, Waltham Forest is one of the answers where these come from, because they have been so successfully bedded in Waltham Forest, and of course not without controversy. Absolutely, we'll talk about that later. But some of these have been in now for 4 or 5 years, and you see the real effects. And this, what you're looking at here, are some readouts of air pollution indications. Of course, this is a scourge of our residential areas in our cities, frankly. And if you're not going to tackle vehicular movements, you're not dealing with air pollution. And that's what they have done there. In a more fundamental sense, we are just following in the footsteps. So we, Oxford, hopefully, and certainly Waltham Forest, 5 years before us, are following in the footsteps of the Netherlands, right? And you're looking at a picture of Utrecht here. This is just a residential district in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And this is an example of a low traffic approach. And this is like regularly implemented throughout the Netherlands in residential areas. And what I've highlighted here is you can't drive through. This is just normal here. There's not going to be any through route in this area because it's not appropriate for through route. It's not appropriate for shortcutting traffic. So we're sort of 30 years later following what's just standard practice in the Netherlands, but that's good. I mean, it's better than later than never. So what's happening right this moment? This, as I said, is a very exciting time to be looking at these issues in the UK. And so we'll talk a little bit about the UK context. There's no way I'm going to expect you to read this huge letter. It's a 2-page letter, but I think this will go down in the history books as being one of the most important factors in the change that we're seeing this year. And this is a letter from the Department for Transport to local authorities. And it's a sort of a follow-up letter that local authorities got a letter on December 9th saying, we're releasing funding for these kinds of interventions, right? Very specifically, kind of very serious interventions like a low traffic neighborhood, which feature modal filters. So serious interventions to prioritize active travel. And we want this stuff for a number of reasons, one of which is because we're going to be encouraging people not to use the bus, and we just can't have gridlock with people resorting to their private car. So we really need to give people the option to walk and cycle. So we want you, local authorities, to implement the stuff, and we're going to give you some money to do so. And I'll just, highlight maybe just one part of this letter. It says, anything that does not meaningfully alter the status quo on the road will not be funded. So they made it really clear about what they were asking for in exchange for these monies. And we'll talk a little bit about this. This is called the Emergency Active Travel Fund, and it's being allocated in 2 tranches. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So there's someone named Brian Jones, who goes by I am Brian Jones on Twitter, fair, understandably enough, who has been really diligently collecting information on the response of local authorities to this Emergency Active Travel Fund. It's super helpful. He's done this. And you can see he's collected all of the cases of these interventions that are being put forward by local authorities, and he's tagged them very helpfully. So what I've done is made a little pivot table of those. And I'm kind of interested here in ones that are either under construction or have already been implemented. And I'm only interested in area-wide schemes, right? He's also considering maybe just a single point closure, which doesn't necessarily constitute an LTN, but we want an area-wide scheme. That's a proper LTN. And so, there's 46 here between the constructed ones and those ones being currently implemented. There's 46 across the country, which is just like a sea change compared to a year ago. So this is happening nationally. Now in Oxford, let's talk a little bit about the situation. What is Oxford's background? I think it's just worth going over this a little bit, at least so I can maybe talk about Oxfordshire livable streets somewhat, because I'm really proud of what we've done, really embracing the concept of the low traffic neighborhood and trying to introduce it to the city and to the county. And so, for example, OLS ran a crowdfunder last summer to try and just to hire the lead engineer from Waltham Forest to come and do a privately funded study of a neighborhood in Oxford to see what would be an appropriate budget for a low traffic neighborhood here and what might that look like, etc. And also we wanted to fund the creation of a movie about low traffic neighborhoods, which we did do, and so that all went off really well. And there's if you go to our YouTube channel, so it's Oxfordshire Livable Streets, you can find us on YouTube. You'll see that movie here, and I really would encourage you to have a look at that. I'll talk to you about that more later. And then here's the study that was done. So this is Chris Proctor who did the study. And then we also, did a 3-day weekend extravaganza to talk about LTNs. We called it Mini Holland Weekends, and with a series of meetings in the city. And just to have a little bit of a big splash, and we had Annalise Dodds out as well to kind of celebrate this and to judge a children's drawing competition celebrating LTN. So basically, when COVID happened and the Department for Transport announced this emergency active travel money a year later, there were at least some folks ready to hear that, and a local authority that was already on the way towards this as a policy. We'll talk about policy in a second. And also an elected member, at least for this area of East Oxford, where we were sort of focusing our campaign, the elected member of the local authority, the highway authorities, which is our county council, who was very keen and ready, very ready. So when the call came out, we've got some active travel money from the county council, and what do members want to do with it? Our members said, I want a bunch of filters, I want a bunch of moto filters and a bus gate. So that worked out. That was a good result. So in terms of COVID, there's this group called the Coalition for Healthy Streets and Active Travel, of which OLS is one of the founding members. And COSAT ran a survey sort of online to gauge people's experiences of their roads and streets during lockdown, because of course people noticed it was a lot quieter, and we just wanted to sort of quantify that a little bit. And out of all those questions, the ones I want to bring to your attention are these two. One is question 18, which says, rate the effect of each measure in preserving pandemic level traffic volume in your street in a post-COVID world. And you could rank these measures from 1 to 5, with 5 being the most effective in your judgment. But also question 19 was saying, okay, now take these same measures and tell us what your appetite is for them. In other words, 1 is I have the least appetite, least interest in this. 5 is I have the most appetite. And so you can actually tabulate those, and on the full sample, which turns out to be 333 people in Oxford, and you get for additional, you can look at the top here, it says additional speed humps or visual nudges such as tree planters. This is exactly how the wording of the question is. There was sort of a smattering, a mixture of desirability and judgment about effectiveness. So no, and if you look at the very right-hand column, that total will show you, this is percentages of these 333 answers. You can see there's actually no mode here, so to speak, in the statistical sense. There's no one dominant viewpoint in terms of how effective these things are. It's sort of spread out. Then you look at this option, which is physical infrastructure changes, creating no through traffic. And this is dramatically different, right? So, a majority of people thought this was, rated a 4 or 5 in terms of effectiveness, and a majority rated a 4 or 5 in terms of their appetite and willingness to see this. So I think that's really important. I promised you a bit about the policy context in Oxford. I'm just checking time, we're doing fine. Policy context in Oxford. I think it's important to talk about policy because I think a lot of us, and myself included, probably 3 years ago before I came to this whole area of transportation, you just kind of think, well, you just get on with it, right? You just policymakers, decision makers just have to just do this stuff and that's it. But it's not, obviously not as simple as that. There is a policy context guiding the creation of things like anything that would be like a low traffic neighborhood. And in Oxfordshire, there isn't a policy in favor of low traffic neighborhoods yet, and that's important, right? The highway authority is not in a position to say we're setting out all of our ambitions for low traffic neighborhoods straight away. And this is sort of before COVID, I should say. But what they had done, and this is all before COVID, they had embraced this concept very strongly, okay, with several visits down to Waltham Forest and meeting with their counterparts, councillors in Waltham Forest and officers as well. And in the latest set of transportation policy documents, it's called Local Transport and Connectivity Plan, LTCP. Some people call it LTCP 5 because it replaces or overtakes LTCP 4. In this, low traffic neighborhoods are an explicit paper, an explicit dimension of the transportation plan. And so people were asked in this consultation I'm showing you here, they were asked to comment on that among many other things. There are many papers here, but one of them was explicitly about low traffic neighborhoods. So it was already being warmly embraced and strongly embraced by the local authority before COVID. And more recently, a motion was passed. This is in July 14th in the county council. John Saunders, councillor for the Cowley division of the county council, introduced this motion saying this council supports the concept of low traffic neighborhoods and will aim to introduce them when and where feasible. It was agreed unanimously. So that's the policy context. Now we can get on to the slightly more juicy stuff to do with what I mentioned was this emergency active travel fund. And I told you earlier that this is the monies for this are being dispersed in 2 tranches. So let's look at that a little bit more. What you're looking at here are potential low traffic neighborhoods associated with these 2 tranches of the emergency active travel fund. Now, these are, we'll talk about the consultation and the framework for introducing these in a minute, but in terms of the geography, probably worth spending just a little bit of time on this page, because I suppose many people probably would like to dwell on this for most of the talk. I won't do that. So what I won't be doing here is showing you particular locations for modal filters, because I don't know that, I'm not privy to this. But these are the outlines of the low traffic neighborhoods that have been notionally indicated by the local authority. And I just want to point some of these out. So the bottom 3 on your screen there are in the Cowley division. And these are the 3 that are potentially associated with the tranche 1 of funding. So the first tranche of the Emergency Active Travel Fund. And it's interesting to note that initially, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but initially, so when Oxfordshire Liveable Streets was promoting the concept of a low traffic neighborhood, really we were focusing on Florence Park alone, on that neighborhood, on that estate, mainly because we wanted to raise awareness in one place to start with, as a kind of foundation. But some of the feedback we got probably, it was very strongly positive, but some of the feedback we got back when we had open meetings, as you used to be able to do in a meeting hall, like in the community hall, one of the very strong feedback we got, I would say, is that why are you just interested in this area? This is not fair that you're just doing this for this area. What about other places? And so when it came time for OLS to at least try to advocate for the East Active Travel Fund, plans to put our view forward, because that's all we're doing. We're just an organization. One of the things that we asked is, please would you consider these 3 parts of the division? You could create 3 low traffic neighborhoods here. So I just wanted to point that out. Others I want to point out here are, and I should also mention, due credit, 100% due credit. John Saunders the division councillor for this whole area was very clear that he didn't want only a Florence Park LTN. He was very aware of shortcutting traffic in Temple Cowley and Church Cowley, and that needed to be addressed as well, and was very keen to address all of those. Anyways, just moving on a little bit, just maybe working our way north. This wedge here, this sort of pizza wedge here is basically associated with St. Mary's area, St. Mary's Ward. It's a bit bigger than that. And then that's Cowley Road, you can see, and then across the street, across Cowley Road here is this is Divinity Road. I've got my cursor on, and potentially reaching all the way to St. Clement's. So this could be considered a low traffic neighborhood. And then in the northwest, I think everyone knows, and it says right there is Jericho. And then over here in the northeast, you've got 3 potential low traffic neighborhoods in Headington. And again, this is just my own map gleaned from information that the council has told its members and has talked about on its website, etc. And so this is, my sort of best guess. So you can't hold me. You can't hold the council to this, anyways. I wish you could, but you can't. So, but I thought you should have a look at what is hopefully in the offing, anyways. And just before we kind of leave the brass tacks, I just thought it'd be worth showing one slightly more detailed schematic of a low traffic neighborhood. In this case, 3 low traffic neighborhoods. These are the 3 I mentioned earlier in the Cowley ward. Cowley division. And this is a nice map because it, rather than kind of drawing a border around the LTN, which just gives you a false sense of being trapped in the LTN or something, or being us and them or something like this. This is a much better way of looking at it, which is basically just shows ways of ingress and egress by car, and that's quite a useful thing a way to present this. And I would just say, those of you paying attention, particularly at this, I wouldn't, because who knows where the actual filters go. If this happen at all, we don't know where the filters will go. Although I would guess this is pretty close to what should happen. But in Temple Cowley, it may be a little bit different. You see 4 filters there. Maybe initially it wouldn't be so many as that. Maybe later it could be, but I suspect initially probably wouldn't be as many as that. But to be a low traffic neighborhood, it has to totally circumvent shortcutting. So whatever the filter arrangement is in Temple Cowley, it will be one that doesn't allow shortcuts. Okay, so consultation. I'm going to check my watch here. We don't have loads of time, so I will go through this. This is what you're used to seeing. If you follow this, this would be what you might be used to seeing when the highway authority comes to make some changes to the road layout. This is what you might be used to seeing, which is kind of this 3-step process, which is engage, consult, and then build. And I think there's reasons why there's a way to do this, but it's not the only way in law for the local authority to proceed. There's another way, which is, so that's a traffic regulation order. They could also use something called an experimental traffic regulation order, which is, again, starts with engagement, which is, raising the issues that need to be resolved. And I've used here an example like congestion, right? That's a problem that needs solving. And then suggesting how to solve it. And the example here is connecting Oxford. And I know we're straying off path a little bit, but I think the County Council did an exemplary job with beginning this conversation about quite a radical plan, which is connecting Oxford. And they started it just in this way, an engagement, say, here's the problem we see, congestion, here's a suggestion for how to solve it, what do you think? And that was much more in the engage, consult, build dynamic. Some of the low traffic neighborhood activity we're seeing now, and actually the vast majority, is under this engage, build, consult dynamic. And so what we're doing here is an engagement, but then a build. So this is what we're going to be doing, and we're going to be putting in a low traffic neighborhood using temporary materials like tree planters. And then we're going to see how it works. We're going to be responding to your feedback. We're going to be changing it as we go. We're going to be adapting and tweaking as we go. And then after you've had a chance to really experience it, let the traffic patterns bed in a little bit, settle down a little bit. It does take time. So, but then after, 12 months, then ask people through a vote, hopefully a piece of paper through the household, every household, hopefully, and then being able to say, okay, I want this or not. How do you feel about these motor filters? And then the highway authority can say on that basis, do we want to make this permanent or not, or do we want to roll it back? So this is the ETRO. And this, I accept this is a challenging way to proceed. There's reasons why I think this regulation was introduced in 1984, so it's very old. And the reason it's been introduced is it's extremely difficult to make change. Like hell hath no fury, like a drive, someone who has been told their drive vehicular access has been modified. It is a really, really, it can be quite a thorny issue. And so this legislation was introduced to allow the highway authority to get on with something that they think might work. And so people have a chance to actually experience it and not just be shouted down, right? So if you let people shout something down, then the majority never actually get to see what it's like. So this is a way to try and do it differently. And here's a great example. I just want to show you this example. This is Islington Borough Council in London in response to the Emergency Active Travel Fund money. And this letter went through all the households, and it just says, dear resident, this is what we're up to. We are going to trial out one of these low traffic neighborhood schemes. This is why we're doing it. Here's a map to say how you get in and out under this trial. And here's the consultation part. After 12 months, we will hold a public consultation. Residents will be asked if they want these measures to stay. So I think that was a pretty, that is the kind of engagement that you would want to see your local authority do, and really be out front on that. And by way of news, and I think we're coming to my close now, by way of news, Grant Shapps recently wrote, he's the transport minister, he recently wrote a letter in the Daily Telegraph. And I just want to highlight one of the things he said in that letter. He said, we're also telling councils that now the height of the emergency has passed, there's more time to consult people. So it may be the case that in Oxford, you will see a bit more of that consultation first before the bill. I just have no idea, but I did take note of this sentence in Grant Shapps' letter. We're near the closing. I want to leave a message for those of you watching who are already kind of keen on low traffic neighborhoods or are going to become keen, maybe after seeing this and exploring it more, and maybe talking to people who live in Waltham Forest or visiting it somehow. I do want to leave this message, which is to say, as a campaigner, I would encourage you to preserve your psychic energy. And what I mean by that is the change is very difficult, and you'll find that some people are very, very challenged by these changes. And it's really important to listen to people and who may be curious about this or have very strong concerns. And I think, so many of these concerns are valid and need to be heard out. That's important, but it's difficult to do that. And what you may find is that you run into a matryoshka doll of complaints. So what I mean by that is this kind of whataboutery. In some cases, you'll find out after engaging with, what about emergency services? That's not a problem. What about disabled people? And these are friendly schemes for disabled. I won't go over all of the things, but you'll go through layer after layer of whataboutery, and you eventually realize you need to economize on the whataboutery that you personally are willing to go through. I mean, leave that maybe to someone fresher who's willing to go through that whataboutery. But at some point, you have to say, listen, I don't think your concerns are about the low traffic neighborhood. I think there's something else going on here. And finally, with a message to councillor, I've got two messages to councillors. One is I just grabbed from Twitter from the wonderful Chris Kenyon, who was very involved in London's transformation to more cycle infrastructure, years ago, gosh, probably a decade ago, almost a decade ago. It says, councillors, you can make short car journeys easy, or you can make walking and cycling safe and pleasant, but you can't do both. And I think that's a fair statement, right? And that we would all like to think you could do both, but the evidence of that wishful thinking is all of the pinch points and traffic calming infrastructure all over our streets up and down the country. That's evidence that we want to do both, but you can't. So it's a choice. Please be brave. And I'm going to leave the final word to Clyde Lokes.
my message to councillors, whatever party, is you didn't come into politics to just simply manage that status quo, to accept that everything that you inherit is simply the right thing to do for the right reasons. Surely you came in to make a difference. Surely you came in to change things for the right reasons, to deliver better improvements and outcomes for your local area, for your local people. If you want to manage the status quo, then fair enough, that's your judgment. If you want to make a real difference, then start encouraging active travel. Start by challenging and questioning the status quo that says your local residential streets have to be the domain and priority for through traffic. Start challenging those perceptions, those ideals that have unfortunately shaped our planning, our highways for decades. Challenge it. Civilization will not collapse.
And I should say that Clyde Lokes, I was very quick to let him have that last word. Clyde Lokes is the deputy leader of the Waltham Forest Borough Council, and as a portfolio holder for environment and transport, he is the person most associated with their low traffic neighborhood schemes. And it's been a real journey for him, and he's here to tell us and to tell councillors, you know, this is something you can do, but you've got to be brave if you want to see this happen. You have to be brave. And with that, I believe we're on to questions, and I will stop sharing screen.
Thank you very much, Scott. Fascinating, and you won't be surprised there's lots of queries already coming in. I think I should start with one that we got in prior to the talk. So we had a query from John Nealon, who is part of the Highfield Residents Association, and said that in a meeting in Headington recently, someone from Headington Liveable Street suggested that the LTNs might reduce general traffic in the local area by about 10%. And he wondered if there's any research that backed that up.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I wish there were more research on LTNs specifically. What we do have are some traffic count data from Waltham Forest before the implementation of their centerpiece scheme. That's the Walthamstow low traffic neighborhood scheme. And then after, I think it's 6 months after. And they counted all of the roads, including the perimeter roads. And overall, it's 15% decrease in vehicular movements. And you can see why when you go, because it's just so nice to go walk and cycle and scoot there, and to let the kids go without the car. So it makes a huge impression.
We've had a couple of questions that have been typed in as you've been talking. So a couple from Anne Lee about, well, you mentioned disabled people and the elderly. What effects are there on this? I mean, she's positing that, you know, is there an increase in loneliness, or is it difficult for people to get out because of increase in taxi fares because of them having to take a roundabout route?
Yeah, it's interesting. I totally understand that concern. I'm not aware of research impact, so specifically looking at the impacts on perhaps elderly. And so all I can do is speculate, and you won't be surprised to hear me say, my guess would be it has the opposite effect, precisely because of the Donald Appleyard work that I did cite, which shows that when you do these low traffic interventions, people can come back onto the street. And so those elderly people can, as residents of their area, can rub shoulders in a pleasant environment with their neighbors. And they may be people that they hardly ever speak to. I myself live on a pretty busy road, and it's probably the case that I know my immediate neighbors better than the people across the street.
Okay, and a couple of questions from Claire Ridley. So you mentioned connecting Oxford. How does this sort of fit in with that? And maybe tied into that is what's the role of and the benefit of bus gates? Are these things all tied in together? Yeah,
so what a super question. I think LTNs are really strong complementary measures to area-wide, like city-wide schemes, so so-called demand management schemes. So when we think about bus gates, this is what travel planners refer to as a demand management scheme. And I think absolutely these things are complementary. In fact, I would almost, you know, since our focus is LTNs, one reason I would love to discuss bus gates is because you know, one of, I think, the most pertinent and really important concerns raised around LTNs is the impact on periphery roads, so roads that border the LTNs. And, you know, people quite rightly, and I, you know, friends of mine, people I know here in the estate where I live, very concerned living on a periphery road, and very concerned what's going to be the impact for me? What's in it for me? Why should I embrace this concept? And I think there's several, I think, as I say, I think it's totally understandable. I think there's several reasons why you should embrace it. But one of my constant answers is, all this means is we have to address overall traffic demand throughout the city. So let's not stop with LTNs, by no means. Let's continue on to things like bus gates and demand management strategies, of which Connecting Oxford is one, which will help alleviate road vehicular movements on all of our streets. And so I think they go together extremely nicely. But I think if we don't start with LTNs, we don't get anywhere. So it's like we need to do both, but let's start with the quick interventions and really build up that base of support and get everyone pulling together for an area, you know, citywide scheme. And we could talk for ages about that. And in fact, I'd love to come back sometime to talk about that demand management strategy for Oxford. I know we don't have time right now.
Okay. And just following on from the bus gate side of things, what's the evidence about, or the possibility of what's going to happen with the ring road in terms of pushing traffic onto the ring road?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So OLS, Oxfordshire Liveable Streets, recently hosted a conversation with the Deputy Mayor of Ghent in Belgium, where they adopted a bus gate strategy in 2017. And so we had him come on and speak in a format very much like this about his city's experience with their adoption of an even bolder bus gate strategy than the one that's being proposed for Oxford. And of course, the ring road traffic was the main concern, because his city's scheme precisely redirected cars to the ring road to get across the city. They could no longer drive through sectors of the city. And I think, and we could all look at the video because he just says it on the video. I think he said that the ring road traffic is up by about 7%, but that actual journey times across the city are down. So because it's alleviated congestion so much. They were suffering the same kind of congestion that we all know we get in Oxford. They suffered in Ghent. And after they did the plan, they had a quicker journey. If you had to use your car, you would have a quicker time of it, an easier time of it using the ring road. Now, I'm not saying Oxford is Ghent. Of course, there's key differences. But I should say that when Ghent was proposing its bus gate plan, its model was Groningen in the Netherlands, which is much smaller than Ghent. And people told them, well, listen, you can't be Groningen. Ghent is so different than Groningen. How can you do this? And I feel the same way when it comes to Oxford. It's like, well, we're not actually as different from Ghent as Ghent is from Groningen. It's just, we would just be the next stage up in terms of scale from what Ghent has done. But again, that's another evening. I think we should talk about that another time.
Great. And a couple of points from Oliver Wright. Firstly, he was wondering where the Furness letter is, whether that's available publicly.
Yep. I am good. I'm glad he's asked, because I think everyone should read it personally. So I'm just going to grab it here and put it in could I just put it in the chat box? Would that work?
Yeah, I don't know. Are we allowed to circulate letters? I don't know.
Oh, sorry, Ian Salisbury. I couldn't make you out there.
I don't know if we can put it on a link on our website or something like that. Perhaps we could do that afterwards. His other point was that I think you've addressed this really by showing the map of the different LTNs. But he's saying, is there a danger that there are neighbourhoods with vocal middle-class inhabitants that do this at the expense of others nearby?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, and I think that's an important concern. And yeah, you're right, Ian, that I did address that. Interestingly, when I talked about the Florence Park area, which we were promoting, OLS was promoting a year ago, just as the kind of the beginning of this concept for Oxford, just as one test case, and that was precisely the kind of pushback that really stuck. That really. People really took that on board, when it came time to actually start thinking about implementing this kind of stuff. Is like, we can't do this just for Florence Park. We have to do it for a wider area. And I want to say one other thing about that wider area. So I showed you that map that showed a cluster of LTNs down in Cowley, a cluster in Headington, and even a couple in closer to the plain in Cowley. And the virtue of this also is that you're enabling active travel over a much wider area. So it turns out that you probably could look forward to a bigger evaporation of traffic. So a bigger inducement to active travel because you're enabling this over a much wider area. So for example, a school catchment in the Florence Park area would take in both Temple Cowley and Church Cowley. And now if you do all three of those LTNs, you're allowing children from that wide catchment area to come in by active travel. So that's another virtue, that's another reason to be bold and do big areas at once. Yeah.
Question from Christopher Coombe about some of the specifics. So things like emergency vehicles and deliveries, vehicle travel for people who can't walk or cycle. How are those dealt with?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think one of our best experiences, again, is from Waltham Forest, where these concerns were often raised. And, it came to the point where they FOI'd, people who were concerned about this FOI'd the emergency services and asked them, what about your response times? And they'd actually fallen, because you've just taken some of the congestion out. And then there's a quote on the We Love Waltham Forest, or We Support Waltham Forest Mini Holland webpage. There's a quote there from the borough commander for the fire services who says, I support this, and I see no reason why this is a problem for us. This is going to help. So, again, sometimes this, it's sometimes is a valid concern, other times it's just a red herring. It is the case that, these bollards and filters, if it's a really desperate situation, those emergency vehicles can actually just drive right through them. These are like tanks, they're massive. They can go straight over a bollard, and the bollards are designed for that anyways. So if it's a really, really desperate situation, then they go through. But the truth is, they would learn how to get around just as we do today. Oxford City, my friend, I think I mentioned Danny Yee, I think he's put together a list of all the bollards and filters that already exist in Oxford without actually being an area-wide scheme, like the one I showed you in East Oxford. These are all over the city, and we all just learned how to get around them. And no one's saying, oh my God, how's the emergency services getting into East Avenue? It's just taken as read that they will go the way that everyone else goes who needs to drive.
Okay, that's great. I haven't managed to ask every question, but I think we are coming up to the hour, and I think I've dealt with all the main themes. So many thanks for that, and I think I should hand back to Ian Green to give the vote of thanks for your contribution.
Yes, thanks, Ian. Thank you very much, Scott. A very clear exposition of low traffic neighbourhoods, what they are and where they come from, and the status of them in Oxford. That's very good. Very helpful indeed. In particular, I very much like the emphasis you gave to how do you effect change. And I think one of the things that we've observed in the Civic Society is that in the case of LTNs and in the case of bus gates and the case of other particular transport policies, it's really very necessary to have some information available when the innovations are being introduced. We need to know something about the potential benefits with some evidence behind it, and also the risks that they carry, again, with some evidence behind it. And even if we have experimental traffic orders and the thing's going to be run on for a year or so, and people can try it out, it's still important before the action's taken that there's as much information available as possible, and there's an openness, a transparency about the information that is or isn't available, and perhaps it identifies what surveys need to be done to find out. Some of the evidence that you gave, some of the results of surveys were extremely interesting, and some of that survey data here in Oxford I think would be very helpful. Otherwise, you get instant objections and a hard road for the politicians to travel to implement things. So a very, very useful talk. Thank you so much, Scott. I would like to say that as far as I can see, political support is growing for LTNs. And a lot of that is down to the efforts you've been making with Oxfordshire Liveable Street. So thank you very much for that. Well done. And thank you very much for the talk this evening.
My pleasure.
Just before we go, I'd like just to mention to the people who are still on the Zoom, we've got two more transport orientated talks coming up shortly. One is the future of personal mobility on the 10th of November, and another one on the railways of Oxfordshire on the 18th of November, bringing us up to from all the way from 1844 up to the present day. Before that, the next talk is on the 15th of September with Rewilding, Restoring Ecosystems. And on the 19th of October, we've got our favourite local historian, Liz Woolley, talking about Oliver Gibbs, the Oxford politician and peace campaigner. So I hope some of you will join us for some of those talks that are coming up in our autumn programme. Thanks again to Scott, and also to Ian Salisbury, our programme group coordinator and organiser of tonight's talk. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our future talks. Thank you and good night.